there's a couple things I want to touch on, but I think, frankly, the biggest question, and this really is a large and important question, is, are the political changes that are happening in Europe right now about to happen in the United States? Is it possible that what we're seeing in these multi-party systems, these proportional representation states, where it's fairly easy to track and see the direct outcome, where the far right is rising in power, could the rise of the far right in the United States, not through the mechanism of individual parties gaining larger pluralities in the elections, gaining larger voter base in the elections, as it is in Europe, but rather being part of the Republican Party, lead to the Republican Party's comeback in a very significant way in the United States? And if so, what will the issue that it'll be around? Well, I guarantee you the issue it's going to be around will be, as it always is, not the real issue that the right is committed to, which is money. It'll be around immigration, the other, as it were, and nationalism and populism. And in a way, the left in the United States, and particularly the Democratic Party, to the extent that the Democratic Party represents the left, is really blowing it big on this thing. So anyhow, first of all, what's going on in Europe and why this is important to us? Today's Financial Times, the headline article by Vincent Bolin in Milan, Michael Stern in Amsterdam, Thomas Eskrit in Budapest. Far right makes inroads based on rising insecurity. Sound like that might apply here? The far right made gains in the elections to the European Parliament, with voters in Italy, the UK, Hungary, and the Netherlands, among others, supporting candidates who espoused explicitly anti-immigrant, anti-Islamic, and hardline nationalist platforms. Now, let me point out that nationalism, not in the National Socialist nationalism, breast beating, table pounding with shoe type of nationalism, but nationalism of, our country first, not in a way that harms other countries, is something that really was a big part of the progressive movement in the United States back in the late 19th century. I mean, a really big part of the progressive movement. And it was historically part of the Democratic Party. I mean, that sort of nationalism, that whole perspective, all of that stuff, that was part and parcel of Franklin Roosevelt's agenda. It was one of the things that tied the Democratic Party successfully to our success in World War II and afterwards. But for some reason, I would say since the 1980s, and I dump everything in Ronald Reagan's lap, but actually maybe the last 2 years of the Carter administration even, although I don't think that Jimmy Carter was part of this, but since the late 70s, early 80s, Democrats have been embracing this bizarre internationalism as if it was some sort of logical extension of embracing the United Nations. Now, the United Nations is there about peace, the single most significant issue around which the United States or the United Nations was formed, and really originally the only issue around it which it was formed, was to prevent international wars, was to prevent there from being another World War I, World War II. And, we joined the United Nations, and there are all these treaties that have to do with when and under what circumstances you can go to war and when you can't. But somehow the Democratic Party, many people within the Democratic Party and many people on the left have said, well, the UN, yeah, this is great internationalism. Let's do away with borders. Let's do away with nation states. And that mentality has also been within Europe, the mentality that led to the creation of the European Union and the embrace of the European Union by people on the left in Europe. And they're now getting they're now getting spanked. Back to this story in today's Financial Times. Italy's Northern League, which is stridently anti-foreigner, more than doubled its share of the vote to 10.2% and won 8 seats in the European Parliament. In Hungary, the Jobbik Party, with its anti-gypsy platform, won 3 seats. In the Netherlands, the Freedom Party of Geert Wilders, the maverick politician who has become the face of anti-Islamic sentiment across Europe in the past few years, won 4 seats. In the UK, the anti-Islamist British National Party, which actually sprung out of the old British Nazi Party, won its first 2 European Parliament seats because of widespread dissatisfaction with the ruling Labour Party among, get this, white voters in the depressed industrial North. You know, when the last depression brought about the rise of fascism in Europe. It brought about Mussolini in Italy, it brought about Franco in Spain, and it brought about Hitler in Germany. And in every case, there was a them that they were pointing to. In many cases, it was the communists, and obviously in Germany, Hitler used the Jews very heavily as the them that he was pointing to, but they always have to have a them. The gypsies. Analysts said, back to the Financial Times article, analysts said there was a pattern to the rise of the far right. It was able to exploit what seems to be a rising sense of insecurity and hostility to immigrants. For example, the Northern League, quote, legitimizes a politics that is shared by xenophobic forces that are on the rise nearly everywhere, especially in Holland and Austria. High on most far-right parties' to-do lists, however, is keeping Turkey out of the EU. Oh my God, Turkey. A lot of brown people in Turkey. We've got to keep them out of the European Union. That's become a big, election issue in Europe. Northern League officials said the party would be working above all to block illegal immigration and the entry of Turkey into the Union. Gideon Rachman, editorializing in today's, or op-edding in today's Financial Times. The UK was the only one of the 6 big EU countries where the governing party did not come under first or a close second. And his point is that although there was a rise of these right-wing parties across Europe, which I just shared with you, the center-left coalitions in most of the major European countries still held. They still control power. And they would be considered by American standards wildly socialist because they're in favor of healthy unemployment benefits, unemployment insurance, national free health care, free education, free college education, a year, 2-year extended unemployment benefits, all these things that are just considered normal. This is the mainstream. This is the center to the center left in Europe. But in the UK, the Labour Party, which is supposedly center left, fell apart. And Paul Krugman had a really insightful piece on this a couple of days ago in the New York Times, maybe it was yesterday, the day before, in which he was pointing out that had Al Gore won the election, and, of course, we all know that he did, but had Al Gore become president, the only president of the United States who was never president of the United States, had he become president, and we had 8 years of a Gore administration instead of a Bush administration, the economic crash still would have happened, because it was during the Clinton administration and before that all the protections were pulled out of our economy that prevented us from going down the tubes. The same thing happened in England. The same thing happened in the UK. Unlike the rest of Europe, the rest of Europe has regulated their banking systems, and by and large, they're fairly solid, particularly the Scandinavian countries. They never deregulated. But with Thatcher in the UK and with Reagan in the US and the mentality that followed that over a 25-year period, we deregulated this stuff, and it set the stage for this disaster. And what Krugman was pointing out is that if we'd had a Democratic administration for the last 8 years, even though we wouldn't have had a war in Iraq, other things would have been very different. One of the things we would have had is an economic disaster right now. The Democrats would be being blamed for it. Well, I'm telling you, the Republicans are fixing to blame the Democrats for the ongoing economic problems of this country, and they are by no means resolved because the structural things, as you've heard me say many times, none of them have been significantly addressed. And B, I predict that the Republican Party is going to look at the rise of the far right in Europe and say, we can play that race card real effective. In fact, they already are with Sotomayor.